Georgia's human history spans thousands of years. On this episode, we'll visit a few historic sites around the state that tell the story of Georgia and see how these sites are preserved for future generations. Next on Georgia Outdoors.
Funding for Georgia Outdoors has been made possible by a grant from Mary Hall Singleton and by the Imlay Foundation.
Over the centuries, man has left his mark across the state of Georgia, from Native American burial mounds to forts and battlefields, to Victorian-era homes and plantations. Within the state park system, there are 18 designated historic sites from important periods in the development of our state. Coming up, we'll tour a few of these sites and learn a little about Georgia's history through enthusiasts who are keeping the traditions of old alive. Georgia's story begins over 12,000 years ago with our native people. Archaeologists have discovered traces of native cultures in every region of the state. Some of the most recognizable remnants were...
There's no one mound builder culture in the Southeast, although that's a colloquial term that people use quite often. But there actually were several periods of time during which Indians built mounds, and for different purposes. Indians built little low mounds sometimes to bury their dead in. They also built mound complexes around 500 to 700 AD in that ballpark.
These mound complexes developed over the course of hundreds of years. Mound sites in our state include those at Kolomoki State Park and Historic Site in southwest Georgia, Ocmulgee National Monument near Macon, and Etowah Mounds Historic Site near Cartersville. The mounds at Etowah are some of the best preserved in the southeast. The impressive Temple Mound rises to a height of 63 feet and is accessible by a wooden staircase. Though the mounds appear lush and green today, it was a very different site centuries ago when they were inhabited.
They would have been barren. There would have been no grass, no trees. They would have been a rather reddish color from the red ochre clay that we find here in this area. And the village area as well, there would have been very little vegetation. As many as 2,000 people may have lived here.
Today, grass and vegetation are allowed to grow along the sides of the mounds to prevent erosion. In order to better understand this culture, the site often hosts events designed to educate and entertain the public.
We do primitive skills demonstrations here once a year. We try to find people who really do this authentically and accurately.
Okay, you got it now?
Craftsman Carl Etheridge gives visitors a swing at a few weapons used by Native Americans.
As the crowds come through, I go through a little explanation of the different types of tools and weapons, and this is just a smattering of what they may have been using, but a collection that I put together, I've manufactured myself and experimented with. So it's sort of history, living history. It's rewarding to be able to educate and to give somebody an experience once they've been here to actually get some hands-on.
When this stuff flakes, it's 10 times sharper than any steel ever made. This is basically what they call flint knapping, which is the art of making stone tools. What you do, you take flakes off the side of it and drive it into the middle to thin it out into shape. A simple point you probably sit down and make about 15 minutes. There's definitely an art to it.
Potter Michael Stuckey is also carrying on a native tradition.
I'm making and firing pottery the way the Indians did in the Southeast. You build it by hand, you let it air dry for 3 days to a week, or the longer the better, and then you set it around the fire and you dry it out gradually. If you dry it out slow enough, you can put it into the hot coals without it breaking.
Once a year, Etowah offers a unique experience. Tours by torchlight.
The reason we wanted to have the torchlight tour is because of the atmosphere of night. And in Indian cultures, a lot of their ceremonies were performed at night by torchlight and by firelight. We have about 800 torches and about 100 or so luminaries on top of the mounds. People walk a torch-lit path led by a tour guide, and they have different interpretive stops where interpreters tell them about a particular part of that site's history.
Over on the side, we have very large dugout places, pits.
And down at the river, we have the dugout canoe maker. He's burning the canoe, and this would have been an activity that may have been performed at night. There's not a whole lot in this country, in the eastern part of this country, that remains of our Indian heritage, and we want to really bring that out to people and expound upon it, and have more sites protected possibly. And I think we're making great inroads on this as time goes on.
Several historic sites paint a portrait of Georgia before statehood. Wormslow Plantation, a colonial site south of Savannah, was occupied during the 18th century.
Wormslow is the country home of Noble Jones, who was one of the first colonists to come to Georgia in 1733. And he came out to this area in 1736. And he started his fortified home about 1739, and we have the remains of that structure today, and it's the only architectural remains in Savannah that you can see from that early time period. It was made of tabby. Tabby is a mixture of sand, lime, and oyster shell. Most of the remains that we have are of tabby.
The staff at Wormslow goes to great lengths to ensure visitors have an authentic experience of colonial life. Interpreters at the site often dress in clothes from the era and demonstrate the traditions of the 18th century.
This is where the American spirit was shaped. You know, the people that came from England to Wormslow, to Savannah, to Georgia, they came as people wanting a new start. This shows what our nation started as, how we all came here and in some way or another we remade ourselves.
Fort King George is another important site in the story of colonial Georgia. From 1721 until 1736, Fort King George was the southern outpost of the British Empire in North America. From here, General James Oglethorpe led one of the decisive battles in establishing the British frontier.
They ended up defeating or helping defeat the Spanish at the Battle of Bloody Marsh, which was fought on St. Simon's Island, and that pretty much cemented Britain's claim to this area and expelled Spain permanently from the area. We try and impart upon visitors the fact that Fort King George was pretty much the first step in the process toward the establishment of Georgia.
Though the original wooden fort was destroyed long ago, many of the structures have been rebuilt, ranging from barracks and palisades to indigenous huts and scout boats.
It's really a time period in history that is oftentimes overlooked by a lot of historians. It's a testimony to exactly what was going on at the time that caused the establishment of Georgia.
Near Midway, Fort Morris is another important stop in Georgia's history. No structures have been rebuilt here. All that remains are these earthen mounds, but the soil is rich with history.
Fort Morris is very unique in several aspects. This is the only known Revolutionary War era fortification left in the state of Georgia, so it is rare in that regard. Also, there's sort of several forts in one here. Fort Morris was built in 1776 to protect the town of Sunbury from British threat from Florida. Then during the War of 1812, the fort was reconstructed to once again protect against any potential British threats against the colonists in this area.
Archaeological excavations of Fort Morris and the neighboring town of Sunbury have revealed much about the ways of life during the American Revolution.
We found wonderful evidence at that fort of occupation from the Americans and from the British. The fort was conquered by the British on January 9th, 1779, and after that it was where a lot of New York and New Jersey loyalists lived for about 6 months. The town of Sunbury, which is right next door to it, was the second largest town in Georgia. It was a thriving seaport from the 1750s until around 100 or so. A lot of the work we've been doing in Sunbury is uncovering evidence of this town. But it's also an area where there's a lot of housing going in, and it's threatened with modern development as the town's kind of coming back to life. So the pressure is on for archaeologists to kind of get in there and see what needs to be protected and what historical resources are located there.
Between the Revolution and the Civil War, Georgia was known for its vast plantations, and the king crop was cotton. Owned by a single family for more than 140 years, the Gerald Plantation near Macon holds a history of cotton and sugarcane production that spans generations.
One unique thing about Gerald Plantation is it has 20 original historic buildings that stayed in one family's possession for over 150 years. We've got 20 original buildings on their original locations. You actually see the land as the Geralds saw it as you walk through it. Majority of the farm tools are still here. 90% of the possessions are still here. And at Gerald Plantation, we try to put you into that time period so you can see how people live.
Though cotton was its main crop, the Gerald Plantation also produced sugarcane and cane syrup. In the fall, the Gerald Plantation Historic Site hosts syrup making and storytelling, an event that combines many traditions of the people who lived here.
Today is syrup making and storytelling. And the reason we do it this time of year is the Geralds and most people of that time period made syrup, usually in the fall. And sugar was a really big deal back then. So most people that could made their own. Nowadays, sweets are real common. Back then, they were fairly rare.
This is about a 1915 sugarcane grinder here. It was made by Southern Plow Company in Columbus, Georgia. This is the second setup that was set up here by the Geralds. They originally had the mule-driven press where the mule walked around in a circle and ground the cane. And this setup was set up about the time that they changed to steam power down here and set up a sawmill for their cotton gin and all.
After the juice is collected, it's boiled for several hours to allow the water to evaporate. This group prepares the syrup the old-fashioned way.
It takes, I think, 10 stalks of cane to make a gallon of juice, and 10 gallons of juice make a gallon of syrup. We all get together and be friends and doing what they used to do a long time ago. It's still an instrument. We always learn something new.
The day also involves cooking demonstrations and tours. The Gerald Fiber Guild is on hand to demonstrate how the clothing of the era was made by hand.
The Fiber Guild is out here to demonstrate things people used to do with fibers throughout history. Spinning, knitting, looms. I think working with your hands is good. A lot of people enjoy it. I do. It's a good way to spend your time, and it's fun to make things on your own.
I just think it's an important part of our history. It's something that we don't want for it to die out. When you become more commercialized, you forget about the forgotten arts.
Music was also a popular pastime on the plantation. This group sings the songs of the era before television and radio.
We're all members of historical reenactment groups, and the music just kind of grew out of that time period, the ambiance of the whole period, a love for everything about that period. We love the traditional music of this country. Some of this music is what people called country music years ago.
While the Gerald Plantation's main crop was cotton, farming on the coast produced a different crop, rice. Huffle Broadfield is one of the most well-preserved of the vast rice plantations of Georgia's coast.
Huffle Broadfield Plantation is located about 10 miles north of Brunswick or 6 miles south of Darien. The rice plantations, you only had the land that was available from Cape Fear, North Carolina to about the St. Mary's River in Georgia. So it was only this X amount of land that was available, and this was just prime real estate to continue what they were doing up in South Carolina.
The plantation was founded in the early 1800s by William Brailsford of Charleston. Today, visitors can experience the plantation much as it was in the era of its heyday.
When people get to visit Huffle Broadfield Plantation, there's very few that don't walk away from here really touched by the authenticity of this place. The architectural construction of the house is actually considered low country plantation house, and a lot of people expect to see terra. And that's not the case with rice plantations. Because of the threat of the malaria at that time, low country plantation houses were more with the big porches where you could capture the breeze, and they were only lived in originally November through March.
Some of the most popular historic sites are those from the Civil War. On the Georgia coast, sites like Fort Pulaski National Monument attract thousands of visitors a year. Just south of Savannah, Fort McAllister played a key role in defending the coast during the Civil War.
The fort itself was built to defend the Ogeechee River. When the war started, a blockade was set up in the Savannah area to keep the Confederacy from exporting cotton. Fort McAllister was built basically to protect the plantations upriver on the Ogeechee River from Union invading forces. It was an earthen fort. Only took a few months to build it. Started off as just a 2-gun battery, and before the war was over, it was a 24-gun fortification.
Much of the history here actually lies at the bottom of the Ogeechee River. This is the final resting place of the CSS Nashville, a blockade runner whose remains lie at the bottom of the river adjacent to the park.
It's the only blockade vessel in the state of Georgia that we can actually document. And this year we started an underwater archaeology quest to document the Nashville and the area around the Nashville as an underwater battlefield, to be able to tell exactly where the ironclads were sitting when they bombarded the fort, to tell exactly what was going on the Nashville when she sank and things like that.
Fort McAllister was the last stop on General Sherman's march to the sea. The brief defense of the fort was one of the final battles in the only war fought on U.S. soil.
About 200 men, 240 men, tried to defend the fort from anywhere from 3,000 to 7,000. The figures vary when Sherman captured Fort McAllister. The folks at Fort McAllister were very clear to say, we never surrendered. The fort was overpowered.
Other state historic sites are important because of their former residents. The Little White House was built by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1932 while he was still governor of New York.
The Little White House at Warm Springs was built as a residence for Governor Roosevelt while he was there, and he would spend several weeks per year at the Little White House.
Roosevelt came to the area to take advantage of the therapeutic waters of nearby Warm Springs. He would visit periodically and became a local fixture. On April 12, 1945, President Roosevelt suffered a stroke while posing for a portrait. Visitors can view the unfinished portrait at the site.
The state has endeavored to try to keep the house just as it was the day he died, but they have made some accommodation for visitor use.
In addition to the house itself, the Little White House Historic Site features a museum which helps to tell the story of Roosevelt's time in Georgia. Museums like this can be found throughout Georgia's historic sites, and the task of caring for the artifacts falls to the crew at the State Park Preservation Lab.
There are 4 employees who all work on managing, conserving, and caring for over 250,000 artifacts that are in the system. A whole range of things that they have to care for.
Some historic sites are preserved not because of battles, famous inhabitants, or lost civilizations, but because they represent something unique in Georgia history. The Lapham Patterson House near Thomasville is one of a kind. Built in 1885, the house was a second home for Charles Lapham, a survivor of the Great Chicago Fire of 1871.
It's a very unusual house, but it does meet the criteria for being a Queen Anne building. So its architecture is Queen Anne, which is an American type of architecture that was very popular from the mid-1870s up through about 1910. One thing that's really unusual is the fact that as you walk through the house and go from room to room, there aren't any right angles in it. All of the rooms have different shapes. One room has a curving wall. And of course, this house has something that no other building in the world has. When you go upstairs, you walk behind a fireplace and you walk through a double flue chimney. over the fireplace to go upstairs.
The Lapham Patterson House serves as a monument to architectural innovation and creativity. As we grow and continue to develop in Georgia, preserving sites like this becomes even more important.
Just like we have plans in effect and rules and regulations to protect wildlife and all our endangered plants in the state of Georgia, we need to protect the buildings too. They're just as endangered.
The job of finding and protecting historic resources in Georgia is a collaborative effort. Archaeologists, conservators, and interpretation specialists work hard to find and share artifacts and properties that shed light on Georgia's rich history. This group of archaeologists is at Magnolia Springs State Park, looking for evidence of a Civil War prison camp.
Camp Lawton was a Confederate prison camp that was built to replace the more famous prison camp at Andersonville, run by the Confederacy. Camp Lawton was designed to be much bigger than Andersonville. The only remaining portion of Camp Lawton is the remains of the earthwork fort that guarded Camp Lawton. But most of the park you see here now was constructed on top of Camp Lawton back in the 30s.
Most evidence of the prison remains hidden in the earth. Thanks to modern technology, archaeologists can find out a lot of information before they dig. One important tool is ground-penetrating radar.
It's a geophysical method, and it use antennas, and the antennas transmit an electromagnetic energy wave. And so when that wave is penetrated, it's directed towards the ground, which is why we call it ground penetrating. It travels through the ground surface until it comes into contact with any physical or chemical changes in the subsurface.
The goal of the project is to find and mark the stockade wall of the prison, which was destroyed long ago. Previous work with ground-penetrating radar shows the wall may possibly have crossed here. So it's a good place to start digging.
They've had a couple hits where they believe the wall to be, and so we're out here basically ground truthing it, trying to actually find it. It is a lot of hard work. It's fun, but you definitely have to move a lot of dirt to get where you're going.
Archaeologists aren't just looking for artifacts when they dig. The group discovers a discoloration in the soil that they think might be a part of the stockade wall.
We saw a very nice linear feature of ash of a gray soil because it was forming a line that kind of indicates a cultural affiliation instead of just being like a root.
Further analysis revealed this find was not a part of the stockade, but another part of the camp. So the search for the wall continues, with a hope to one day accurately mark this important part of Georgia history. Preservation often involves intensive work refurbishing and restoring. Such is the case with Hardman Farm, a historic site in progress.
The Hardman Farm is a historic property located near Helen on the west end of the Nacoochee-Sahti Valley. Most people who come to Helen recognize the landmark of the gazebo on top of the Indian Mound. Across the highway to the north from the Indian Mound is an Italianate villa built in 1870 with accompanying outbuildings and a farming complex which includes a dairy barn, a bullpen, a dairy manager's residence, and a brick store.
The property was once owned by former Georgia Governor Lamartine Hardman, who operated it as a dairy farm. His descendants eventually passed the property on to the state. After the state acquired the land at Hardman Farm, the difficult task of restoring the buildings began.
The buildings were in a state of disrepair. There's a lot of rotten wood, some structural problems, some roofing problems. All of them needed paint. Our first phase of this project was a stabilization project. Dairy barn, it was listing 16 to 18 inches on the lower level. The contractor jacked the whole building up, and then it had to be moved back over to 16 to 18 inches for proper alignment. So now the building is structurally sound and hopefully will withstand the ages, but yet when you go in the building you can see the original construction.
The iconic gazebo, built atop a native burial mound, presented its own set of challenges.
You can't dig in the top of an Indian mound to jack it up, so we were able to slide some members up under it, weld on top of them so that we could jack from the surface of the mound. Once we got it jacked up, we took the floorboards out and poured a concrete slab so that we could protect it and rebuilt the sills. It's been said quite often that it's probably one of the most photographed sites in Georgia. We see people stop beside the road very often photographing the mound.
Eventually, Hardman Farm will become the next in a long line of historic sites which tell the story of Georgia.
Ultimately, when we have restored all of the buildings and the artifacts, we would like to have a living, working farm and allow people to experience what a dairy farm in the 1920s would have been like. It's really important to preserve these properties because we lose so many parts of our history day by day with development. So there are fewer and fewer of these as time goes by. And this gives them a chance to come back and develop an appreciation for people who lived in the past and their accomplishments.
Georgia's historic sites offer a unique first-hand look at the story of Georgia's people, their triumphs, and their tragedies. As we grow, it's important to remember where we came from. These sites are publicly owned and open for you to enjoy and experience.
Funding for Georgia Outdoors has been made possible by a grant from Mary Hall Singleton and by the Imlay Foundation.